At approximately 9:18 hours on February 24, 1945, over the foothills north of the village of Vinola in northern Italy, a single American fighter aircraft descended to an altitude no tactical manual permitted. The aircraft was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and 500-pound general-purpose bombs. Its altitude dropped to less than 60 feet above frozen ground. At that height, the canopy was low enough to catch snow and debris thrown upward by the propeller. Trees rushed past beneath the wings. Stone walls and farm buildings flashed by in seconds. According to United States Army Air Force's doctrine, this flight profile should not have existed. Close air support missions in early 1945 were governed by strict altitude and dive angle limitations. Fighter bombers were instructed to make attack runs from approximately 1,200 feet or higher. This altitude provided time to identify the target, release ordnance, and recover before entering the densest envelope of small arms and anti-aircraft fire. Flying lower dramatically increased the probability of aircraft loss. Dozens of pilots had already been killed attempting low-level attacks against prepared German positions. Command no longer asked for volunteers to fly beneath doctrinal minimums. Yet this aircraft continued to descend, ahead, along a jagged ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley. German artillery positions had pinned down an entire American infantry battalion for 3 days. The guns were dug into reverse slopes, invisible from ground observation. Camouflage netting and rock revetments concealed the emplacements from aerial reconnaissance. Each time the infantry attempted to move, the ridge erupted with precise shellfire. The Fifth Army advance had stalled. Air support had been called repeatedly. Medium bombers dropped ordnance through cloud cover based on map coordinates. Fighter bombers dove through gaps in the overcast and released bombs on estimated positions. Craters appeared across the hillside. The artillery remained intact. Accuracy at standard attack altitudes was insufficient. Survival was doctrine. Precision was not guaranteed. Every other pilot assigned to the target area had already aborted their runs after descending to safe limits. This aircraft did not dot at the controls. Sat First Lieutenant Raymond Knight, 23 years old, assigned to the 350th Fighter Squadron of the 12th Air Force. He was flying alone. Moments earlier, during the pre-mission briefing, Knight had been instructed to conduct a routine medium-altitude attack against suspected artillery positions. Weather was marginal. Visibility was limited by haze and low overcast. Anti-aircraft resistance was expected to be heavy. Knight had listened. He had taken notes. He had not spoken during the briefing. After dismissal, he had approached the operations officer with a request that bordered on insubordination. He wanted to fly solo. He wanted to descend to treetop level. He wanted to make repeated passes until every gun position was either destroyed or confirmed abandoned. The operations officer had reminded him that doctrine existed for a reason. Low-level attacks against dug-in artillery were considered near suicidal. The P-47 was heavily armored, but it was not invulnerable. A single burst through the oil cooler could seize the engine within minutes. Hydraulic lines, control cables, and fuel systems were all exposed at low altitude. Knight acknowledged the risk. He explained his reasoning without raising his voice. High-altitude bombing was scattering ordnance across empty hillside. The enemy guns were concealed and protected by terrain. The only way to locate them was to fly low enough to see muzzle flash and disturbed earth. The only way to destroy them was to place ordnance inside the revetment. Not near it. The officer did not approve the plan. He did not forbid it. He told Knight that if he chose to fly that way, he would do so on his own judgment. No wingman would be ordered to follow him down. Knight accepted. Now, less than an hour later, he was alone over hostile terrain, descending beneath the cloud ceiling into a zone that doctrine defined as lethal, the Italian front. In early 1945 was defined by geography. Mountains rose in jagged succession. Valleys funneled wind, sound, and machine gun fire with equal efficiency. German forces had learned to exploit this terrain, placing artillery on reverse slopes where direct fire was impossible and observation unreliable. The guns firing at Vinola were not randomly positioned. They were placed deliberately to halt movement, not to win territory. A single well-placed howitzer could stop an infantry company for days. That was exactly what had happened. Knight eased the throttle forward. His airspeed increased past 300 knots. The ground rose toward him as the ridge filled his windscreen. Snow-covered fields gave way to broken rock and tree line. Everything compressed into seconds. At this altitude, there was no margin for error. There was no time to reconsider. From the perspective of manuals, statistics, and accumulated losses, the decision Knight had made should have resulted in his death before any meaningful damage could be done. A single fighter, flying alone, at treetop level, against prepared artillery positions, should not have been able to survive long enough to identify targets, let alone destroy them. Yet the aircraft continued forward. The situation represented a direct collision between formal doctrine and a calculated deviation driven by necessity. The manuals defined what was survivable. The battlefield demanded something else. What followed over the next 11 minutes would determine whether the assumptions governing close air support were limits of physics or merely limits of procedure. According to United States Army Air Force's tactical doctrine in early 1945, the flight profile Raymond Knight had chosen should have failed for clear and measurable reasons. Fighter-bomber survivability was calculated around altitude, speed, and exposure time. At medium attack altitude, typically between 1,000 and 1,500 feet, an aircraft spent only seconds inside the effective envelope of small arms fire. Anti-aircraft gunners had limited time to track, lead, and fire. The probability of a disabling hit was considered acceptable within those margins. At treetop level, those margins disappeared. Small arms fire was no longer incidental. It was continuous. Rifles, machine guns, and light anti-aircraft weapons were effective at direct line of sight. At 60 feet above ground, even a single rifle round could strike critical components. The P-47's air-cooled radial engine depended on an exposed oil cooler mounted beneath the nose. A puncture could drain lubricant in minutes. Control cables ran externally along the fuselage. Fuel lines fed wing-mounted tanks. None were armored against sustained ground fire. Doctrine treated low-level flight as an emergency condition, not an attack method. There were also aerodynamic limits. At low altitude, there was no room for recovery from error. A minor misjudgment in pitch or roll could result in terrain impact. Propeller wash disturbed snow, dust, and debris, reducing visibility further, while sheer near ridgelines created unpredictable lift changes. Standard manuals warned that flying beneath 100 feet in mountainous terrain significantly increased the risk of controlled flight into terrain, even for experienced pilots. Bomb delivery physics made the attack profile worse. General-purpose bombs required release altitude and distance to arm properly. Fuses depended on airflow and rotation to become active. At extremely low altitude, premature impact risked bomb malfunction or blast damage to the aircraft itself. To avoid this, pilots were instructed to use delayed fusers or higher release points. Knight was flying too low for conventional delivery methods. Dive bombing accuracy was also compromised. At low altitude and high speed, the time between target identification and release shrank to fractions of a second. Aiming errors were magnified. There was no opportunity to correct. Misses at that level were wasted passes that exposed the aircraft again and again. Standard doctrine allowed one attack run, sometimes two. Repeated passes were discouraged. Each pass increased cumulative exposure. Loss rates rose sharply. With repetition, Knight intended to make multiple passes. Enemy defenses compounded the problem. German artillery positions were rarely isolated. They were supported by infantry units equipped with machine guns and light flak weapons. These defenses were designed specifically to counter low-flying aircraft. Flak whirling mounts, firing multiple 20mm cannons, could saturate a valley with fire. Even rifle and machine gun fire could damage control surfaces or wound the pilot. At low altitude, evasion was limited. Speed was high, but maneuvering room was constrained by terrain. Climbing away required time the aircraft might not have. From a mathematical perspective, the probability of survival dropped with each second spent over the target area. Combat analysts understood this. Doctrine reflected it. Pilots were trained to minimize exposure, not maximize precision. Knight's plan reversed that priority. There was also the issue of mission scope. A single fighter bomber was not expected to neutralize an artillery battery on its own. Doctrine assumed coordinated attacks. Multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously from different angles to overwhelm defenses. Alternatively, heavy bombers would saturate an area to suppress fire. Even if accuracy was imperfect, Knight was alone. Without wingmen, there was no mutual support, no suppression, no distraction. Enemy gunners could focus entirely on a single aircraft. Loss rates for solo low-level attacks were among the highest recorded during the war. Commanders knew this. That was why Knight's request had not been approved, only tolerated. From the standpoint of engineering, training, and accumulated combat data, the mission profile Knight had chosen should have resulted in one of three outcomes. The aircraft would be shot down before locating the guns. It would be damaged and forced to disengage after a single ineffective pass, or it would crash due to terrain or mechanical failure. Neutralizing multiple concealed artillery positions through repeated low-altitude attacks was not considered feasible. Yet the doctrine was built on assumptions that did not fully account for the specific terrain around Vinola. The German guns were dug into reverse slopes. They were invisible from above. High-altitude attacks dispersed bombs across empty hillside. The artillery survived because it could not be seen. Accuracy, not survivability, had become the limiting factor. Knight understood this intuitively. He was not rejecting doctrine out of recklessness. He was responding to a situation where doctrine no longer produced results. The manuals defined what was safe. They did not define what was effective under these conditions. From a purely physical standpoint, Knight's plan relied on reducing distance to overcome concealment. At low altitude, he could see muzzle flash. He could see disturbed earth. He could identify revetments and firing pits hidden from aerial reconnaissance. The trade-off was exposure. Doctrine assumed exposure always outweighed precision. Knight was betting that, in this specific case, precision outweighed exposure. The impossibility was clear. A single fighter, flying alone, at treetop height, making repeated passes against prepared artillery, should not have survived long enough to matter. The manuals were explicit, the statistics were unforgiving, the risks were cumulative. Yet Knight continued descending toward the ridge, accepting a level of exposure that doctrine defined as unacceptable. What followed would test whether those limits were absolute, or whether they were contingent on conditions doctrine did not fully capture. Raymond Knight was 23 years old in February 1945. He had not entered the Army Air Forces with a reputation for recklessness. His training records described him as methodical, quiet, and technically competent. He was not known for aggressive flying or disregard for procedure. Instructors noted that he paid close attention to terrain, weather, and aircraft limitations. His strength was not speed of decision, but consistency. Before the war, Knight grew up in California. He worked mechanical jobs that required patience rather than improvisation. He learned early how machines behaved under stress and how small misjudgments could compound into failure. These habits carried into his military training. When he entered flight school, Knight progressed at a steady pace. He was not among the top performers, but he did not struggle. His gunnery scores were solid. His navigation was reliable. He demonstrated an ability to remain calm under pressure, particularly during instrument flying and low visibility exercises. He was assigned to fly the P-47 Thunderbolt without incident. The P-47 was not an intuitive aircraft. It was large, heavy, and unforgiving at low altitude. Many pilots disliked it initially. Knight adapted to it slowly and thoroughly. He learned its acceleration, its dive characteristics, and its limitations. He understood how much punishment it could absorb and where it could not. His early combat missions in Italy followed standard profiles: medium altitude bombing, limited dive angles, strict adherence to doctrine. Like most pilots, he experienced frustration when bombs failed to produce visible results against concealed targets. Artillery positions remained active after attacks. Infantry on the ground continued to call for support that air units struggled to provide accurately. Knight listened closely to ground reports. He noticed a pattern. Bombs released from standard altitudes landed near, but rarely inside, artillery revetments. Smoke and dust obscured observation. By the time results could be assessed, the guns were already firing again. The issue was not lack of ordnance, it was lack of visual confirmation. Knight began studying the terrain more closely. The Italian front differed from North Africa and France. Mountains and valleys compressed engagements into narrow corridors. Artillery placed on reverse slopes could fire effectively, while remaining invisible from above. Standard aerial reconnaissance missed them entirely. Maps did not capture subtle ground features that mattered in combat. Knight did not raise these observations formally. He did not propose changes to doctrine. He kept notes. By early 1945, the Fifth Army advance had slowed repeatedly due to well-placed German artillery. Infantry units became pinned for days. Requests for air support increased. Pilots flew repeated missions with limited effect. Knight began considering alternatives. He understood the risks of low-altitude flight. He had seen aircraft lost to small arms fire. He had attended briefings that emphasized loss rates for low-level attacks. He knew the statistics. He also knew that continuing to fly higher was producing predictable failure. His decision to request a solo low-level attack was not impulsive. He did not ask for permission to break rules. He asked for latitude to use his judgment. When the request was not approved but not denied, he interpreted that silence as acceptance of responsibility. Knight was not seeking distinction. He was responding to a specific problem that standard methods had failed to solve. His focus remained narrow. Identify the guns, destroy them, reduce pressure on the infantry below. His background influenced his approach. Knight trusted what he could see more than what was assumed. He believed that proximity could substitute for theory when conditions demanded it. That belief did not conflict with his training. It extended it into an area where doctrine had stopped as he descended toward the ridge outside Vinola. Knight was not acting out of confidence in invulnerability. He understood the aircraft could be lost at any moment. He understood that survival depended on precise control, timing, and restraint. He was not attempting to redefine air support. He was attempting to complete a task. Everything that followed depended on whether his understanding of terrain, aircraft behavior, and enemy positioning could compensate for the exposure he was accepting. Knight crossed the ridge line at approximately 9:21 hours. The altitude was now so low that individual stones and scrub brush were visible passing beneath the wings. Airspeed exceeded 300 knots. At that speed, there was no margin for hesitation. Every control input had to be deliberate. Any abrupt correction risked ground impact. As the aircraft cleared the ridge, the valley opened in front of him. Almost immediately, flashes appeared along the reverse slope. Short, bright bursts. Muzzle flashes from concealed artillery firing downslope toward American infantry positions. Dust and smoke rose briefly, then dissipated. Knight had found the guns. He did not climb. He did not circle. He leveled the aircraft and aligned his first pass directly along the contour of the hillside. There. P-47 shuddered as he adjusted trim to hold altitude barely above the terrain. Small arms fire erupted almost at once. Tracers rose from multiple points along the slope. They passed above and below the aircraft, converging rapidly. The Thunderbolt's armor absorbed some impacts. Others struck the wings and fuselage without immediate effect. The sound inside the cockpit changed. Sharp metallic strikes mixed with engine noise. Knight focused on a single REVETMENT. At this altitude, there was no time for refined aiming. He relied on instinct and alignment. When the gun position filled his windscreen, he released both bombs and pulled hard to clear the blast radius. The aircraft lurched upward as the bombs dropped away. A moment later, explosions ripped through the hillside. Earth and rock erupted. Outward, smoke engulfed the area. Knight did not wait to assess. He rolled the aircraft and descended again. A second gun fired from farther along the ridge. Its muzzle flash was visible even in daylight. Knight adjusted course and came in from a different angle, using the terrain to mask his approach for as long as possible. Flak intensified. Light anti-aircraft guns joined the small arms fire. Black puffs appeared in front of the aircraft, close enough to shake it with concussive force. Fragments struck the wings. Warning lights flickered briefly, then steadied. Knight held the line. He made a strafing pass this time, firing 850 caliber machine guns into the revetment. The volume of fire tore through camouflage netting and exposed earth. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition detonated inside the position. Again, he did not linger. He climbed just enough to reverse direction and came back in. Each pass lasted only seconds. Each exposed him to concentrated fire. The cumulative effect was measurable. Control forces increased. The aircraft responded more slowly. The engine temperature crept upward, suggesting damage to cooling airflow. Knight continued. He identified a third artillery position by the disturbed earth around it. He lined up and made another strafing run, then released remaining ordnance at close range. The blast rocked the aircraft. but the gun fell silent. German defenders adjusted quickly. Fire became more accurate. Tracers crossed directly through Knight's flight path. One round struck the canopy. Another hit the wing root. The Thunderbolt shook violently, but remained controllable. Knight did not disengage. He had identified at least 4 gun positions. 2 were destroyed, 1 was burning. Another remained active. He came in again. This pass was lower than the others, almost level with the gun pit. Machine gun fire erupted at point-blank range. Knight fired continuously, walking rounds across the position until the gun stopped firing. The aircraft was now damaged. Fuel pressure fluctuated. Hydraulic response was sluggish. The cockpit smelled faintly of smoke. Warning indicators suggested multiple system compromises. Knight turned away at last. He had been over the target area for approximately 11 minutes. That duration far exceeded doctrinal exposure limits for low-level attack. Loss models predicted aircraft destruction well before that point. Yet the guns were silent. As Knight climbed out of the valley, ground fire followed briefly, then ceased. The ridge line fell behind him. The terrain flattened. Airspeed stabilized. Only then did he allow himself to assess the aircraft. The P-47 had taken multiple hits. Control surfaces were damaged. Fuel lines leaked. Oil pressure was marginal. The engine continued to run, but only just up below. American infantry reported that the artillery fire had stopped completely. The valley fell quiet. Knight set course for his forward base, maintaining altitude only as necessary to keep the engine running. He did not transmit a detailed report. He did not claim success. He reported damage and requested landing clearance. Behind him, the ridge outside Vinola no longer fired. The effect on the ground was immediate and unmistakable. American infantry units that had been pinned for 3 days began moving within minutes of the last attack run. Forward observers confirmed that all previously active artillery positions along the ridge had fallen silent. No additional rounds landed in the valley. The sudden absence of fire was so abrupt that several officers initially assumed it was a temporary pause rather than a neutralization. Reconnaissance patrols moved cautiously toward the ridge. Later that morning, they found multiple artillery emplacements destroyed or abandoned. Revetments had collapsed inward. Gun barrels were twisted or buried under debris. Ammunition stocks burned where they had been hit by strafing fire. In some positions, crews had fled without attempting recovery, leaving equipment behind. There was no coordinated German counterfire. The positions had not merely been suppressed, they had been rendered unusable. From a tactical perspective, the advance resumed almost immediately. Units that had been stalled repositioned and pushed through the valley before German forces could establish replacement firing points. The delay that had defined the sector for days ended in less than an hour. Reports began moving upward through the chain of command. Initial summaries credited close air support with neutralizing enemy artillery. No details were included. Low-altitude flight was not mentioned. The assumption was that standard attack profiles had finally achieved effect. When Knight returned to base, ground crews counted multiple bullet holes across the fuselage and wings. Several hydraulic lines had been partially severed. Fuel leaks were evident. The aircraft was declared unfit for further combat operations without extensive repair. Maintenance officers noted that damage patterns were consistent with sustained low-level exposure rather than a single pass. That observation was not included in the initial reports. Knight was questioned by his squadron commander later that day. He described the engagement plainly. He explained that he had descended below standard altitude to identify the guns visually. He described repeated passes. He acknowledged that the profile violated doctrine. He did not defend the decision. He described it as the only option that appeared to work. The response was measured. There was no reprimand. There was also no immediate commendation. The commander understood the results, but also understood the precedent. Official doctrine could not endorse the method without encouraging similar actions across the theater, many of which would likely end in losses. The matter was referred upward. In subsequent days, higher headquarters reviewed the engagement. Ground unit reports confirmed the destruction of multiple artillery pieces. Infantry officers credited the air attack with enabling the advance. There was no evidence contradicting Knight's account. The challenge was classification. Official records favored repeatable actions. Knight's mission was not repeatable. It depended on terrain, weather, enemy concealment, and individual judgment. It could not be standardized or taught without an acceptable risk. The resolution was administrative rather than doctrinal. Knight was recommended for a high award based on the outcome rather than the method. The citation focused on gallantry and effectiveness under fire. It avoided technical detail. Altitude, number of passes, and deviation from procedure were omitted. Doctrine remained unchanged. Air support manuals issued later that year continued to warn against low-level attacks, except in emergencies. The limits remained in place. The reasoning remained sound. Loss rates elsewhere reinforced it. Knight's action was treated as an exception. He did not return to low-level attack missions. His aircraft required prolonged repair. Other pilots were not instructed to replicate the approach. The Fifth Army advance continued using conventional air support combined with artillery and ground maneuver. From an institutional perspective, the outcome was contained. A specific problem had been solved. A larger pattern had not been altered. Knight's engagement outside Vinola entered the record quietly, framed by effect rather than method. It demonstrated what could happen when precision was prioritized over survivability in a narrow window of necessity. Once that window closed, doctrine reasserted itself. In the weeks that followed, the engagement outside Vinola settled into official records without further examination. The Fifth Army continued its advance northward. Artillery, infantry, and air support resumed their standard coordination. No additional missions were flown using Knight's attack profile. Loss rates elsewhere reinforced the logic of existing doctrine. Low-level attack remained classified as an emergency measure, not a method to be replicated. Raymond Knight returned to routine operations once another aircraft was assigned to him. His damaged P-47 was repaired and returned to service, though it never flew another mission under his control. Maintenance reports listed structural and system damage consistent with prolonged exposure to small arms and light flak fire. Those details remained internal. Knight himself did not promote what he had done. In later debriefings, he described the engagement in factual terms. He did not frame it as innovation. He did not suggest changes to procedure. He acknowledged that survival had depended on timing, terrain, and circumstances that could not be assumed elsewhere. That assessment aligned with how the Army Air Forces viewed the matter. When the formal citation was issued, it focused narrowly on results. It credited Knight with destroying multiple enemy artillery positions under intense fire, enabling ground forces to advance. The language emphasized courage and effectiveness. It did not describe altitude, exposure time, or deviation from doctrine. This was intentional. Institutions record outcomes more readily than methods, when methods challenge established frameworks. Recognizing the result without endorsing the approach allowed the Army to preserve discipline while acknowledging contribution. Knight received the award and returned to duty after the war. His service record reflected a competent fighter pilot who had completed his missions and survived the campaign. The engagement outside Vinola did not become a case study. It did not appear in training syllabi. It did not influence post-war doctrine. The reasons were practical. Knight's success depended on a precise alignment of factors: concealed enemy positions that could not be engaged from altitude, terrain that allowed visual identification only at low level, an aircraft robust enough to absorb damage, a pilot willing to accept exposure without expectation of survival. Remove any one of these elements and the outcome changes. Doctrine is designed to function across thousands of sorties, not to optimize for rare convergence. From a historical perspective, the engagement illustrates a limit rather than a lesson. Doctrine defines boundaries based on averages and probabilities. Within those boundaries, forces operate efficiently and predictably. Outside them, outcomes become highly variable. Knight crossed that boundary once, under specific conditions, and returned. The boundary itself remained. The ridge outside Vinola fell silent that morning and did not fire again. Infantry moved forward. The immediate tactical problem was resolved. The campaign progressed. Nothing else changed. The manuals were not rewritten. The altitude limits remained. The loss models remained valid. Knight's action existed as a narrow exception. Recorded without emphasis. It was not intended to be repeated. When the war ended, the field where the artillery had been destroyed returned to quiet. Emplacements collapsed under weather. Shell craters filled with water. Evidence faded into the terrain. What remained was a brief disruption in an otherwise continuous campaign. A single aircraft flew lower than permitted. A specific set of guns was destroyed, but an advance resumed. The event did not redefine air support. It demonstrated that under extreme conditions, effectiveness and survivability can diverge briefly before rejoining established limits. Once that moment passed, structure returned. The war moved on. The doctrine endured.